faithfully delivering value and interpreting great books from around the world.
Hello, this is Sally's Book Talk.
Today, we're exploring the book Culture and Imperialism. You're probably familiar with the term imperialism already. From the Opium War to the founding of New China, China waged struggles against imperialism and feudalism. In this context, imperialism means political military threats, roughly equivalent to Western gunboat diplomacy. Middle school textbooks taught us imperialism represents capitalism's highest stage, a form of Western global economic exploitation. But this book reveals imperialism isn't just political, military, or economic. It's cultural too. This might surprise you since culture is usually seen as independent from socio-political realms. Rather beautiful. How could it connect to something as unpleasant as imperialism? Culture isn't some elegant utopia, it's actually a battlefield where forces compete. Powerful culture equals powerful influence. Western culture deeply engaged in colonial history and expansion, becoming imperialist by helping maintain control over distant lands. Edward Said, author of Culture and Imperialism, ranks among post-war's most influential scholars, key in post-colonial theory. Said had complex identities, Arab by heritage but born Christian, not Muslim. After childhood in Egypt and Palestine, he moved to America for Western elite education. He championed Arab rights while calling himself the last Jewish intellectual, a U.S. citizen, yet fierce American critic. In 1978, Said published his seminal work, Orientalism. I've previously covered it here on Sally's Book Talk. In Orientalism, Said argues the West constructed Orientalism as ideological control, a discourse saturated with Eastern stereotypes. 15 years after Orientalism was published, in 1993, Edward Said released Culture and Imperialism. In a sense, this book is an extension and development of Orientalism. In this book, Said argues that Western culture was deeply entangled in imperialism's global operations, becoming a key way for the West to sustain its dominance and hegemony worldwide. So, we'll cover the main points of culture and imperialism through three key aspects. First, what role did Western culture play in imperialism's overseas colonialism? Second, how did culture help maintain Western imperialist rule globally after World War II? Third, how the Third World resisted cultural imperialism. Now, for the first aspect, let's explore Western culture's role in imperialism's overseas expansion and global colonization. This part is arguably the most academically valuable and intellectually groundbreaking section of the entire book. So let's dive deeper. Starting from the Age of Discovery in the late 15th century, major Western capitalist nations used various tactics to occupy and control less developed countries, turning them into colonies, semi-colonies, or dependencies. In the 19th century, as capitalism evolved into the imperialist stage, the West's division of the world accelerated to an extreme pace. China, too, became semi-colonial and semi-feudal during this era. In 1914, just before World War I broke out, Europe's colonies, protectorates, dependencies, dominions, and federal members accounted for 85% of the Earth's land area. This ideology of carving up and ruling the world was vividly reflected in European cultural works of that time. It's crucial to note that, according to Said, this reflection wasn't passive or unconscious. On the contrary, it was a conscious expression by Western authors, even one of their primary creative goals. And through this active expression, these writers and intellectuals participated in their nation's overseas expansions. For instance, colonialism birthed a common genre in modern European fiction, the voyage and exploration narrative. In this genre, colonization and plunder were repackaged as exploration and pioneering, even glorified with the moral aura of freedom and bravery. Let's examine Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. This novel tells the story of a white man named Robinson Crusoe who encounters a storm during a voyage to Africa and drifts alone to a deserted island. Through sheer willpower and relentless effort, he survives tenaciously on the island and tames a native named Friday. Said argues Robinson Crusoe serves as an imperialist prophecy about a European establishing his own domain in a distant land. Robinson represents the white male creator of new orders, while Friday embodies natives whose existence only gains validity through colonial discovery. Their lives only gain meaning through subservience to Western masters. When readers are moved by Robinson's story, they unwittingly endorse colonialist ideology. This voyage exploration genre extends from Crusoe to Hollywood's Indiana Jones series, featuring white treasure hunters in backward regions. Within this tradition, Side particularly directs our attention to British author Joseph Conrad. His works are among the most profound and complex, with Heart of Darkness being his masterpiece. In this novel, Captain Marlowe recounts his expedition along Africa's Congo River to fellow Britons. No worries if you haven't read Heart of Darkness. It was adapted by Coppola into Apocalypse Now, replacing British explorers with American soldiers and Congo with Vietnam.
But the core narrative remains unchanged.
Through Marlowe, Conrad praises British colonial efficiency and rationality in Congo. Yet through antagonist Kurtz, he warns of Africa's dark power corrupting Europeans from enlightened lands. Kurtz began as an idealist, seeking to bring civilization's light to Africa's darkness. But he became consumed by darkness, degenerating into a ruthless colonizer. Conrad's portrayal of Kurtz showcases his brilliance as a writer. But it's crucial to note that Conrad's portrayal of Kurtz's corruption in Congo isn't a reflection on imperialism or colonialism itself, just a self-warning. Be careful out there. It's too dark. It could turn us good Britons into bad people. In other words, Conrad points out Britain might fail to conquer Africa, but that desire to overcome and conquer isn't wrong. What's more, in Conrad's writing, even corrupted Kurtz still firmly rules the local natives. That said, many modern European novels aren't about distant adventures. Their stories unfold right in Europe. But that doesn't mean they're disconnected from imperialism. Authors weave colonies into their plots through narrative devices, like a wayward youth sent to a distant land for discipline. Think Magwitch in Dickens' Great Expectations, or nobles taking colonial tours. Take Sir Thomas Bertram in Mansfield Park, a key case study in Side's book. On the surface, Mansfield Park is classic Austen, romantic entanglements of Victorian upper-middle-class youth. But Said reminds us, this seemingly harmless work is part of British imperialism, tied to dirty colonial history. The Mansfield estate, home to heroine Fanny, belongs to her uncle Sir Thomas Bertram, who owns an Antiguan slave plantation. Historically, Britain occupied Antigua in 1632, making it a colony by 1667. Its economy relied on enslaved Africans cultivating tobacco and sugar cane. One Mansfield Park never positively depicts the plantation, yet it defines Sir Thomas's status, values, wealth, and explains his travels. Said argues Austen subtly conveys that controlling the Antigua plantation sustains Mansfield Park's tranquility and charm. Said argues for a confusion. Following Austen's line of thought, we conclude that no matter how isolated a British estate is, it needs support from overseas. So, what effect and impact would novels like Mansfield Park have? It would make the British believe that Britain needs overseas colonization. If voyage exploration European novels describe the legitimacy of imperial colonization, then this type describes its necessity. You see, imperialism and colonialism are never simple. They need public support, and Western literature fuels this ideological energy for the metropole. Of course, imperial colonization and rule overseas are never smooth sailing. In such cases, literary works endorse and whitewash imperial rule in the colonies. Let's look at the representative work of British author and Nobel laureate Kipling. And Said points out that while Kipling wrote this novel in India, Indian society was experiencing various anti-colonial movements. However, Kipling completely avoids those upheavals, portraying India as a tranquil, unchanging society to tell his British countrymen.
India's past holds no elements of social change, And now there are no political threats.
Kim, the protagonist of the novel, is a white orphan raised in India. One day, he meets a lama from Tibet who seeks the legendary River of the Arrow to heal, cleanse sins, and escape reincarnation. Kim becomes the lama's disciple, accompanying him on the journey and encountering various British and Indian people. At the end, Kim is persuaded by Colonel Creighton to become a spy, aiding Britain's surveillance of Indian society. Colonel Creighton appears infrequently, but Side sees him as crucial, an idealized embodiment of the British colonizer. Colonel Creighton is a colonial official and also an anthropologist. This dual identity is intriguing. Historically, anthropology was colonialism's closest discipline, and Creighton seems fascinated by all aspects of Indian society. In his view, if the British didn't understand India, they couldn't govern it. After understanding India, the British must tolerate its internal conflicts and traditions like the caste system without changing them. Oh.
Behind this seemingly respectful attitude lies a cruel truth.
What colonizers want is simply domination. Colonel Creighton values Kim greatly because he's exceptionally gifted, chameleon-like in disguise, seamlessly blending into different groups. He mingles with Indian children who conflict over religion and caste, yet Kim gets along with each perfectly. He's a linguistic genius, too, speaking English, Urdu, Kashmiri, Achari, Sikh, and even picking up the lama's Tibetan naturally. Why would an uncultivated orphan possess such incredible language abilities? Kipling doesn't explain, it's probably just white racial mystique. At the story's end, Kim pledges loyalty to Colonel Creighton. This miraculously talented white boy becomes part of British colonial power. This power surveils and politically controls India while obsessively loving every detail, deriving aesthetic and psychological pleasure. Said points out imperialism makes this paradox possible. Kim seems to tell British readers, India is ours, vast and colorful, yet securely held. We can view and enjoy it in the most relaxed, pleasant way. All right, let's summarize this section. Saud argues Western writers participated in colonial expansion through works, not always actively, but shaped by historical contexts that influenced their writings. Regardless, they objectively used cultural power to persuade readers to endorse imperialism.
Next, our second aspect, after colonialism ended, how did the West use culture to maintain imperialism?
After World War II, formal Western colonialism ended, meaning Western imperialism no longer directly controlled many regions. Yet, imperialism persisted in political, economic, social, and ideological spheres, with culture becoming an increasingly vital tool of domination. And the West had transformed. Old imperial powers like Britain and France weakened, while one nation amassed vast wealth from both wars to become the new global hegemon.
This is American imperialism, crucially distinct from earlier European forms.
First, it denies being imperialist, unlike Britain and France, who openly embraced it, Britain with particular pride. America rejects the term, preferring God's own country. Its global influence is framed as enacting God's will on earth. This likely stems from America's founding history. Having fought Britain for independence, it constantly emphasizes its difference from Europe, packaging itself as a pioneering nation unburdened by historical sins. That's why American voyage and exploration stories differ starkly from earlier European ones. Take Herman Melville's Moby Dick. Captain Ahab obsessively hunts a white sperm whale through perils to their mutual destruction. Said notes, this exemplifies American adventure tales, conquering not a place but a symbolic wilderness. Ahab embodies America's global conquest, driven not by practical aims but obsessive immersion in his mission's vast symbolism. Regardless of American denials, it remains an empire, fundamentally no different from prior British or French versions. Said observes the U.S. government's rhetoric about a new world order and its barely concealed post-Cold War triumphalism. Old empires like Britain and France used similar rhetoric, ultimately declaring, "We're the leaders destined to rule," representing freedom and order, all tired Western imperialist cliches. The leaders, secondly, compared to earlier European imperialism, American imperialism has another distinct feature: exceptionally powerful cultural influence.
This isn't about artistic quality, but about unprecedented cultural expansion, fueled by rapid advances in communication and information technology.
Through film, music, theater, literature, and news media, America built a massive cultural empire.
While former empires relied on political, military, economic control with culture as support, America primarily dominates through cultural imperialism. Among all American cultural exports, the most crucial isn't Hollywood or pop music. It's media. A small handful, American multinational media corporations control and produce most news content consumed globally. Thus, America firmly controls global information flow and discourse. Remember, the strongest domination is domination of thought. In this book, Side focuses on U.S. media during the 1991 Gulf War. To rally support for invading Iraq, U.S. media crafted Saddam Hussein as a terrifying, despicable dictator. Labeling him Middle East's Hitler or Butcher of Baghdad, this smear campaign soon expanded from the leader to all Iraqis and Arabs. U.S. media recycled long-standing Orientalist tropes, claiming Arabs inherently understand only force, barbarism, and violence as part of their civilization. Islam was portrayed as an arrogant, cruel medieval religion promoting apartheid. Yet the problem is, even if these were true, America had prior opportunities to change things. Before the Gulf War, America had meddled in Middle Eastern affairs for 2 centuries, yet never supported democracy, women's rights, minority rights, or secularization. Instead, it propped up dictators and fueled massive arms sales to the region. Doesn't this behavior mirror British colonial governance in India depicted in Kim? What angered Side most was how supposedly professional American media became government mouthpieces, publishing absurd content. For example, Winter 1991 saw Foreign Affairs, the prestigious bi-monthly by CFR, publish The Summer of Arab Discontent. It describes Saddam Hussein as America's new rival, a tyrant, a merciless warden from a fragile land. The author seemed oblivious that Baghdad was the pinnacle of Arab civilization, 9th to 12th centuries, birthplace of Islamic art, and linked to Sumerian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and Mesopotamian civilizations. Calling Iraq fragile land makes no sense even literally. Among Middle Eastern nations, Iraq has the most fertile soil, home to the lush Tigris and Euphrates valleys. When war erupted, U.S. news media portrayed it as a painless video game. American viewers never doubted they were seeing truth. Yet it was history's most concealed, least reported war, with all news sourced from U.S. government outlets copying each other. This content was then copied and broadcast globally. Thus, the 1991 Gulf War became synonymous with one image: U.S. Patriot missiles intercepting Iraqi Scuds. But what could be done? Said noted even Saddam watched CNN. For nearly a decade around the Gulf War, Hollywood blockbusters recycled one story: a brawny white American lone wolf or elite military unit fighting Arab terrorists or outlaws. U.S. cultural depictions of the Arab world are so crude, simplistic, and racist, they reduce Arabs to 3 types: dictators, terrorists, and camel herders. It must be noted that Culture and Imperialism was published in 1993. To some extent, Said's descriptions feel somewhat outdated. For example, today's America no longer views the Arab region as its primary adversary, and traditional American media influence has significantly declined. However, the fundamental issues Said identified remain unchanged. Today's America uses cultural imperialism to vilify its current main rivals, methods identical to those used during the Gulf War. As traditional media wanes, transnational internet giants like Twitter, Google, and Facebook gain unprecedented global influence and power over international discourse. Nearly 30 years after Side's book, the world still lives under American cultural imperialist authority. All right, let's briefly summarize this section. Post-World War II, culture became imperialism's primary vehicle, with America leading through film, music, theater, literature,
and news media controlling global narratives. And finally, our third aspect, third world resistance against this cultural imperialism. Where there's oppression, there's resistance. If the 19th century saw imperialist land grabs, the 20th witnessed global anti-imperialist and anti-colonial waves. Former colonies pursued independence through diverse forms of resistance against Western empires. Culturally, Third World nations resist by rewriting Western works saturated with imperialist ideology. Earlier, we noted how voyage exploration narratives in European novels intertwine with colonialism. British author Joseph Conrad's works are particularly representative. Thus, many African writers challenge Conrad by rewriting his works, especially Heart of Darkness, to voice their perspectives. In Heart of Darkness, the Congo River is depicted as mysteriously treacherous. Captain Marlowe navigates its uncharted waters despite his expertise. Because that river is like a maze. You're determined to sail into deep waters, yet always end up crashing into sandbars. What's even more terrifying is that the river seems to possess a surreal power. During the voyage, you feel like you're going mad. Everything you once knew is gone forever. Clearly, Conrad uses the Congo River to symbolize Africa's savagery, danger, and mystery. Thus, African writer James Ngugi begins his work, The River Between, by describing a joyful river. That river is called Honia, meaning wholeness. It never dries up, possessing vital energy that defies droughts and weather changes. Said argues this vibrant depiction resists Conrad's African rivers and European exploration tropes. Another African writer, Tayeb Salih, portrays the Nile in Season of Migration to the north, its flow energizing riverside communities. In fact, Season of Migration to the north is like an inverted Heart of Darkness. In Heart of Darkness, protagonist Marlowe recounts his southward voyage to Africa from a British dock. Whereas in Season of Migration, the protagonist narrates his northward journey to Europe from a Sudanese village. He concludes, "There is no better or worse, only here and there. But I belong here, just as the date palm in my courtyard grows in our soil, not elsewhere." Said deeply admired this cultural resistance. He saw these authors rewriting Western-defined history, unearthing local legends to reshape historical imagination. You might wonder, why spend such effort rewriting Western texts? Why not just tell their own stories? Here, Africa differs profoundly from China. Though both experienced Western colonialism, China's civilization remained largely intact. We can narrate our history and culture using our own writing system, but most third world nations lack this luxury. Even their languages are colonial legacies. Thus, they can only express resistance by rewriting Western texts. One can imagine how difficult it is for these nations to resist imperialist influence. Said notes that a primary challenge for the Third World is rebuilding fractured societies. This responsibility often falls to the national bourgeoisie and elites, like lawyers, doctors, writers, produced by colonial society. These individuals use Western languages, received Western education since childhood, making them ideologically dependent on Western authority and desperately needing external support during Reconstruction. And so, who can help them? Often it's Western nations that step forward. Thus, they often involuntarily make agreements, becoming Western mouthpieces and yes men. In this scenario, imperialism superficially cedes authority to local bourgeoisies while maintaining local hegemony. Even when Third World leaders completely reject Western imperialism, prospects remain bleak because their resolute resistance proves they've accepted Western binary thinking. For instance, Black intellectual Wole Soyinka noted that overemphasizing Black cultural pride leaves Africa passive. Indulging in identity pride only leads to emotional self-intoxication. More crucially, this accepts Europe's confrontational ideological framework, the life or death struggle mentality. How to grasp this? Take racial theory proposed by Western civilization. We all know this. It ranks whites smartest, yellows second, blacks least intelligent. If we Chinese today counter, wrong! We yellows are smartest, you whites are dumber. This seems resistant but still accepts racial differences. Such judgment adopts racial science's mindset. and logical framework. In other words, you're still brainwashed by Western ideology. As Italian theorist Antonio Gramsci observed, rulers maintain control by making the ruled see through their eyes.
So, what exactly should be done?
In his book said, strongly recommends the works of Frantz Fanon, one of the most outstanding Black writers and thinkers in modern times. In Side's view, Fanon's anti-imperialist and anti-colonial thought far surpasses binary opposition, pointing toward true victory and liberation. In his work, The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon notes that anti-imperialist movements worldwide often rely on nationalism, an undeniable historical fact. It's precisely because of nationalism that third world countries gained independence. However, if nationalism doesn't undergo ideological transformation at some point, its future won't be liberation, but imperialism's expansion. And then, for instance, nationalism can morph into nativism, then bring chauvinism, authoritarianism, and fundamentalism, repeating imperial control. This roughly echoes Nietzsche's famous quote, "He who fights monsters must see he doesn't become one. Stare into the abyss, and it stares back." Said points out that Fanon's feared scenario has become reality in many places. In countries like Algeria or Kenya, heroic popular resistance drove out entrenched Western colonial rule. Yet nations quickly fell into dictatorial hands, with no shift in social consciousness, just power repetition. Therefore, Saad believes nationalism is crucial for resisting imperialism during independence struggles. But this independence doesn't mean true freedom. Narrow nationalism offers only limited security. To free all humanity from imperialism, we need new methods and paths. We must believe a universal, diverse, non-coercive world is possible. All right, let's summarize this section. To resist Western imperialism, third world people strive to rewrite their history and culture. This is an effective form of resistance. However, nationalism is a force of resistance that requires caution. The third world must use nationalism to fight for independence, but also transcend it to pursue true freedom and liberation. And that covers the main content of Culture and Imperialism. You might feel Said analyzed and criticized extensively, but offered no concrete solution, because he couldn't. Facing imperialist domination, the world has yet to produce a truly successful resolution. Yet, his approach remains enlightening. Nations once ruled by the West must resist not just the West itself, but its ideological and cultural influences too. We must transcend notions of racial superiority or national domination. Only when such consciousness vanishes will imperialism's influence truly end. Said repeatedly quotes African poet Aimé Césaire in the book. The verse reads, "The work has just begun. Humanity must break countless chains. No race holds monopoly on beauty, wisdom, or strength." Well, that's Culture and Imperialism. That concludes our interpretation. Study notes are below the audio. Until next time.